I was staring at the file size of a digital book, specifically the picture of Dorian Gray, that I finished reading recently, and I realized how incredibly small it actually is. We tend to think of a novel as this massive heavy object and it takes days to read. It contains entire lives, philosophies, and worlds. But in terms of raw data on a computer, it's closer to nothing. Something like a few hundred kilobytes, and it's smaller than a low-quality screenshot. Now, the idea behind the emotional weight of the book and the literal weight of the bits led me to a project I thought would be purely aesthetic. I wanted to fit the entire book into a single image. And as you have seen in my previous projects, I am always fascinated about data. The logic for implementing this felt simple, and this is how I went about it. Every pixel on your screen is just three numbers: red, green, and blue, each ranging from 0 to 255. By a convenient accident of history, standard ASCII text maps perfectly onto that same range. The letter A is just the number 65 and the letter Z is 122. Mathematically speaking, I could just take the text of Dorian Gray, chop it into threes, and pour it into the pixels. The first letter becomes the red value, the second becomes the green, the third becomes the blue. 1000 pixels is at least 3000 characters. With all of this in mind, I realized I could fit the entire novel into a square image smaller than a standard social media image post. Now, subconsciously, there is a part of me that expected the image to look like the book feels. I assumed that when I translated those words into color math, the resulting image would be a vibrant mosaic of some sort. I imagined patterns emerging from the sentence structures, but there was also a part in me that felt that's not what I'm gonna get. I wrote a script to do the conversion, and what I got back was, well, I would describe it as digital garbage. It was more noise than art. I remember zooming in, staring at individual pixels, trying to find any ordered structure that might result from the sentences of the book. But it was just a chaotic mess of random colors. There was no pattern and there was no structure. And that complete lack of aesthetic beauty sent me down a rabbit hole into two specific books. The one I was trying to encode, the Dorian Gray, and a short story by Jorge Luis Borges, The Library of Babel. Then I realized that my disappointment came from a misunderstanding of what language actually is. I was looking for patterns, but I found entropy. And so I googled more about information theory, and the description of entropy in it is essentially a measure of unpredictability. A file that is perfectly ordered, like a string of 10,000 letter A's, is low entropy. Visually, it would look like a solid block of color. It's clean and it contains almost zero information. But a masterpiece of literature like the Dorian Gray, it is very high entropy. It uses a vast vocabulary, and even though there might be some repetition, the more meaning a text has, the more unpredictable it is to a machine. When you visualize high entropy data as an image, it doesn't look like a painting. But to some, it might. It looks more like static. And the image I generated based on the book was proof of the book's complexity. Going deep, that's where Borges comes in. In the Library of Babel, he describes a universe that is an infinite library composed of hexagonal rooms. This library contains every possible book that can be produced by the combination of 25 symbols. Most of the books in there are pure gibberish, with random strings of letters that go on for hundreds of pages. But because the library is infinite, it also contains every coherent book. It contains the true history of your death, it contains the translation of every book into every language, and it contains the lost gospel of Basilides, and maybe Game of Thrones. But here is the horror that Borges presents. Because the gibberish books vastly outnumber the coherent ones, the library is essentially useless. And so I decided to do a simple visual test of this. I went back to the code and I generated a second image. Because for the first image, I used the text of the Dorian Gray. For the second image, I used Python's random library to generate a string of completely chaotic, meaningless characters of the exact same length. I saved them both as lossless PNGs and put them side by side. I wanted to see if the human eye could distinguish between the one with the soul of Oscar Wilde and the one from the random number generator. Placing them side by side, the result was exactly what I expected, but my intuition could disagree. They looked exactly the same even though they are somehow different. Even zooming in, looking at the grain of the pixels, I couldn't tell them apart from gibberish. To the human eye, the meaning of the novel had completely vanished. The masterwork of 19th century literature was visually indistinguishable from digital garbage. This connects deeply to a concept I have done before in cryptography, where perfect encryption looks like random noise. If a message is encoded perfectly, it should betray no pattern. In a strange way, literature is its own form of encryption. It is a code that only works if you have the key, and the key is the human mind, or more specifically, the language it was written in. And without that decoder, the book is just static. Me working on this simple project, I accidentally recreated this dynamic. The static is the true face of the data. It's somehow a visual representation of the sheer, overwhelming weight of information without the filtering lens of grammar and syntax. I'm saying somehow because I used the structure to represent it. Some might argue that there is a weird harmonic connection here, and for me personally, I agree. Borges writes about the search for meaning in a sea of randomness. Wilde writes about the concealment of ugliness beneath a beautiful surface. My program somehow sat right in the middle. And this led to another profound realization of history and preservation. We are currently generating more data in a single day than humanity has generated in entire centuries. We are building our own form of the Library of Babel. Now, the idea from the Library of Babel is terrifying to me because it suggests that meaning is a rarity and mostly an accident. But doing this project made me feel something different. I realized that meaning isn't something that exists in the data. The data is just numbers. The data can be anything. Meaning is entirely in the observer. The book doesn't exist on the page, and it certainly doesn't exist in the pixels of my generated image. It exists in the hallucination we share when we agree that these specific patterns of black and white marks signify fear or love or vanity. I still have the first image, the ugly static one, and you can find it on my Discord, and I will keep it. It's a reminder of what the world looks like without the filter of human consciousness. It's just noise. But it's also a reminder of how incredible it is that we can pull a signal out of that noise. This was fun and quite the exploration. If you enjoyed this video, then leave a comment down below. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.